words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be always acceptable unto you, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Please be seated. How many of you like to put together jigsaw puzzles? Maybe on a rainy weekend when you have gone for a vacation or a weekend to the beach and it's too wet for you to actually enjoy walking on the beach, you bring a jigsaw puzzle with you. Now imagine that you had a jigsaw puzzle, but you were missing the box lid. You know, the box lid which shows you what it's supposed to look like when it's put together. And so you take this odd-shaped little thing, and it's got a little bit of blue and a little bit of green, and by itself, it doesn't really look like anything. But you compare it to the picture, and you say, okay, it looks like the color of green found over in this corner, and this one has two little bumps, and that has two little holes. Maybe it'll fit there. And then you discover that it's part of a philodendron leaf or whatever. I think that pericopes that we read in the Sundays, taken from the Bible, are a little bit like those puzzle pieces. And you might notice I do not very often preach from the epistles. There's a reason for that. The Gospels, not only are they about Jesus, who is the main point of all of this, but they originated as oral teachings. Jesus teaching his disciples, and his disciples remembering those snippets of teaching, passing them on to their students and the people that they met. And then they got compiled and put together into a narrative, but they started as sort of little snippets. And so they make sense as snippets. That's not the way with the epistles. The epistles, imagine it's as if someone took a brief before the US Supreme Court, and they took just a paragraph of that, and they copied it, and they translated it into a different language, and it was copied and translated for thousands of years, and then we're reading it. How likely is it that the meaning we would ascribe to that paragraph had any connection to its original meaning? This passage we heard from Paul's epistle to the church in Rome, I think, is a prime example of this. I read the sentence about how if it is to the adherents of the law who are to be the heirs, faith is null and the promise is void. For the law brings wrath, but where there is no law, neither is there violation. For this reason, it depends on faith. When I hear that paragraph, I hear it through the lens of Martin Luther and his wrestling against what he saw as the works righteousness of the monastic Roman Catholic faith that he was raised in, of his identification of that works righteousness with Judaism, with rabbinic Judaism. I hear it through the lens of centuries of Jewish hatred, Christian hatred of Jews and persecution. I hear it through the lens of generations of people struggling about Works or faith? I hear it through the lens of our English language, in which faith has a meaning of intellectual assent to something, to a proposition. That's not what this was about. We leave out a section of this reading in our lectionary. So after the sentence, we don't hear anything in our reading, do we, about circumcision, do we? No. There's a big section. Is this blessedness then pronounced only on the circumcised or also on the uncircumcised? We say faith was reckoned to Abraham as righteousness. How then was it reckoned to him? Was it before or after he had been circumcised? It was not after, but before he was circumcised. He received the sign of circumcision as a seal of the righteousness that he had by faith while he was still uncircumcised. The purpose was to make him the ancestor of all who believe without being circumcised, and who thus have righteousness reckoned to them, and likewise the ancestor of the circumcised, who are not only circumcised, but who also follow the example of the faith that our ancestor Abraham had before he was circumcised. This letter actually was a lot about circumcision. Now, we don't read that part because it's not particularly relevant to us. Some of you may be circumcised, and some of you may be uncircumcised, and I honestly don't care. Your doctor knows about that. But the context in which Paul was writing was one before we became two different religions, Judaism and Christianity. He was writing to people who were Jews who believed that Jesus was the Messiah, and who believed that Jesus' resurrection was the first harbinger of that day of the Lord in which God was going to make all things in the world right. And Paul had the particular mission to the Gentiles to fulfill the prophecy that, and before that day of the Lord, the nations other than Israel, would turn from their idols and worship the true God, the God of Abraham. And one of the issues then was, so what about these Gentiles who had turned and were worshiping the true God, the God of Abraham, in company with the Jews who believed that Jesus was the Messiah? Were they fully part of the community? Or did they have to be circumcised and follow all of the dietary laws and so forth laid down for Jews? I think Paul would be horrified that his words have been twisted to suggest that Jews, the descendants of Abraham in both the flesh and in faith, were somehow not part of the chosen. I think we also distort it when we hear the word faith and we contrast it to actions. Because the Greek word that Paul uses in this letter means basically faithfulness. And how do you see faithfulness except through what someone actually does? At some place, Paul, in this letter, talks about how everyone will be saved. In the first place, the Jews, and secondly, also the Gentiles. There will be anguish and distress for everyone who does evil, the Jew first and also the Greek. But glory and honor and peace for everyone who does good, the Jew first and also the Greek. For God shows no partiality. Does that sound like someone who thinks that works don't matter at all and that it's only what you believe in your heart? I don't think so. Faithfulness is not something that you take your head and you separate it from the rest of your body, from how you deal with your money, how you relate to other people, how you use your time, and you put your head over here and your heart and what you fervently believe, and it doesn't matter what the rest of you does. That's not how it works. We're one being, head, heart, body. What we do, how we act. And so Jesus, in the Great Commandment, talks about both. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, and with all your soul. And you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus talks about what people do as much more than what they believe. And the faith that Paul was talking about is faith in Jesus as a true Son of God, whose words about God, about the God of Abraham, who is also the God of Jesus, who is also the God of Paul, who is also the God of us, about what that God is like, what God wants us to do.